Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, my very sincere apologies. I should have been the first to welcome you all. I actually commute from Noida, and although I had kept an allowance of roughly 20 minutes, I wanted to be here at 9:40, but there was a breakdown on one of the small bridges, and that took roughly 40 minutes for me to really cross that. So my very, very sincere apologies to all of you. It is, in fact, a great pleasure and indeed a privilege to extend a very, very warm welcome to each one of you. And I'm delighted to actually welcome amidst us Shri Amit Khare, who is the Secretary Information and Broadcasting, as also Mr. Frank D'Souza, who just gave a very, very lucid and I think a very comprehensive overview of the status of the industry at this point of time. As also Mr. K.V. Rao, who is the Chairman of the ASSOCHAM, National Council on Entertainment and Media. Mr. Matt Andrews, who is the Council Global Copyright Protection Netflix. And of course, all the people who have come from media or any other agencies. In fact, we are very fortunate we have a Secretary in Information Broadcasting who is indeed an outstanding officer. I think many of us would now expect many of the key issues facing this sector to be resolved. I'm sure that many of these issues would get resolved in his tenure because I know him personally and I'm absolutely certain about his ability to really address things. He is a very, very straightforward officer who understands the issues and is capable of taking strong decisions. So I am a good augury for the sector as a whole. Today's topic, the theme, the IPR and piracy issues in entertainment and media industry is something which is relevant. It was relevant many decades ago, and it was continue to be relevant many decades from now. Essentially because as long as the economic return on piracy or any such activity overweigh or outweigh the risks, either in terms of punishment or in any other term, as long as it outweighs heavily, I think this tendency of the human beings to really do that will continue. And therefore, the message is that one has to be continuously be alert and keep on coming with stronger and better measures to really contain this menace. Now, how do you really contain something like piracy? I mean, there are several ways, several routes to it. And to my mind, I think there are three distinct routes which need to be taken concurrently. One is, of course, the route of regulation. You have a Copyright Act and you have several other legislations which you can really invoke. You can make them stronger. India's Copyright Act is a robust act. It may not be perhaps the strongest in the whole world, but it is strong enough. And several amendments which have been made in the past really make it something which can become a strong basis to deal with this problem. But then this is an evolving process. It's a continuous process. And this needs to be really constantly addressed. The industry needs to really flag issues that need to be incorporated in the process of legislation. And that must be a continuous process. And to industry, I'll certainly urge that they should continue to do so. Then we have all these new developments. I think most of us like to call them disruptive because all these new technological things, including the OTT, which Mr. D'Souza talked about so well, they're all disruptive technologies. They have completely sent the traditional way of providing a service in a complete disarray. And by the time you get your thinking collected or get your thoughts collected, there is a new technological introduction. And I think this process and the time for you to react to it is definitely much less now. Governments in any case, particularly in the sector, has always been a follower. I mean, the technologies come first and the policies come later. And with the pace of technologies coming faster and faster, you can understand the challenge that the government has to keep pace in terms of formulating policies. But I think this is something which is inevitable. This has to be done. We have several issues facing OTTs. There are issues about regulation as far as a service, OTT as a service is concerned. Whether to give parity to telecom services or not, how do you really deal with it? I understand that in 2015, TRAI came up with some kind of a consultation paper. And I think that issue needs to be resolved, because there are people whose businesses would be affected by OTT would certainly like to say that we need a level playing field, and they must be treated as, maybe for instance, the telcos, the telecom companies, they will like to treat it as, as one like them. And this issue of a regulation of OTT as a service is definitely to be resolved. And then there is an issue of regulation of the content. In the traditional broadcasting media, you have Cable Act, which provides a content code, which governs there. But as far as OTT is concerned, there is no regulation. Whether we should have a regulation, and if we should have a regulation, what kind of a regulation it should be, whether it should be self-regulation or it should be something which the government should impose, are all these issues which are open for discussion. My own take is that a legislation for regulating the media has not succeeded in the past, despite several efforts made in the past. And I don't see very likely in immediate or near future. Self-regulation in broadcasting has worked to some extent. Perhaps there is a need to really strengthen it. And maybe a self-regulation for OTT also could be a viable alternative to think about. It is the whole issue of content regulation is becoming more and more complicated, because as more and more sources of the same content exist, it creates added problems. So that is one route to really, and piracy has been there. As I said, mentioned, piracy was there when we had celluloid films. Piracy is there when we have Netflix and Amazon. I mean, it continues the process. The manifestation changes, the way you do it, it changes, but the basic thing continues. And I was proposing that it will continue, because I think the economic gains people feel who do it is definitely outweigh far more than the fear of penalty. Regulation also means that we should have the enforcement of the existing laws. That is another issue, because enforcement of law again becomes a matter of priority for the law enforcing authorities. Let's take, for example, police, which has to take action. But in India, the police is certainly overburdened, and they have a priority. Given the manpower, given the resources that they have a priority. And therefore, issues of piracy are not very high up in their priority list. So they will like to deploy their resources, etc., in the areas which are a priority for them. How do you really make it a priority for them is something that we need to really think about. And from that, you're also linked with the issue of creating awareness. I personally feel that while a lot of work has been done on awareness, industry has done, they continue to do so. I think that needs to be intensified and perhaps maybe more focused. I think there's a need to sensitize people in law enforcing authorities, apart from the people at large, maybe also judiciary in some way or the other, because prosecutions also will result only when there is a complete and full appreciation of the implications of such offenses. So I think awareness generation is also very, very important for all the stakeholders involved. And then lastly, which I think is the best solution to piracy, is the use of technology. uh, technologies have provided solutions to seemingly intractable problems. And I think since technologies, if you evolve such technologies, they are most effective because there's no question of any enforcement. Technologies are adopted and technologies are used. So it becomes automatic. I mean, it is a challenge to our, our innovative minds and our talents and our capabilities to really think of technologies which can address the issue of piracy. When we introduced encrypting and decrypting of broadcasting signals, that created a whole new array of opportunities, which also, to a large extent, address the issue of piracy in some form or the other. So I think if we can collectively think of and invest in research and find a technological solution to this whole issue, I think that could perhaps be something worth its while. As I said, this issue will continue to be very, very relevant, and it is good that we are holding this, and I'm sure in the course of the deliberations which will follow, and of course we will look forward to the addresses by the dignitaries sitting on the dais. I think we'll certainly be able to get some kind of a roadmap for action ahead. There are all kinds of issues still to be resolved with the new technologies like OTT, while some of the issues still need resolution for the traditional media, conventional entertainment media. New issues has emerged for OTT. There are issues of taxation. Then there are, how do you really deal with the whole model? GST, for instance, since most of it is a bundled service, so the application of GST has again several challenges. How do you really treat a bundled service? I think the traditional way of looking at it is that the principal, the more predominant service becomes the service on which you try to, calculate the taxation. But there are so many varieties and so many ways in which bundling is done that it's really a challenging task to really have a rational taxation practice for such services. There are issues of multiple taxation also. Even after introduction of GST, I think local bodies in some states are still putting some tax on these services, which is resented by, of course, the service providers. And this also issue needs to be really looked at. There are also issues about foreign entities who supply content. So whether that is to be treated as a royalty or otherwise, if you treat it as a royalty, then tax liabilities arise and withholding tax comes into play. So there are large number of other issues also which actually need to be deliberated upon to get clarity, and that will help the industry to really grow. And lastly, I think there's also the issue of storage of content. We have in the draft stage a bill on the protection of piracy, protection of privacy, private data. And I think since the whole business model is based on data, and we cannot really foreclose the possibility of that data being misused. Because more and more, if you have thinking of specialized content, then you would like to know more and more which kind of people are going to like that specialized content. And that perhaps gives you some kind of an incentive to get data. And that could lead to complications. I mean, all these, Cambridge Analytica and all that was basically because you are looking for a certain kind of data and wanting to use it for a specific purpose. So even this issue is very relevant as far as OTTs are concerned. So I'm sure that in the course of the day, all these issues would be deliberated upon, and I'm sure that ASSOCHAM would like actually to, at the end of the deliberations, perhaps based on the discussions, make a set of recommendations and send it to the ministry for their consideration. I do once again welcome all of you and thank Mr. Khare and other people on the, to be, to help us organize this, and we look forward very much to their address and the delivery.